as we have looked at the various visions seen by Daniel, we have learned that it's talking about not only the kingdom or the empire of Nebuchadnezzar, but going all the way down to Rome and the establishment of a fifth kingdom, and that is the kingdom that was brought forth by Jesus Christ. Now we do understand that there are those who want to take all of these visions and make them a prophecy of something in our future. But as we have studied through these visions, we have realized, hopefully, that it's talking about a specific time period, not in our future, but in our past, probably over 2,000 or at least 2,000 years. So Daniel was struggling with everything that was going on. And not only was he getting encouragement from all of these visions, but he was able to encourage others. Now we get down to the vision here in chapters 10, 11, and 12. There's a lot to this. We note that Daniel was really struggling with the situation that was going on. And we read in chapter 10 of Daniel, beginning in verse 1, in the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a message was revealed to Daniel, who was known as Belteshazzar, and the message was true, and one of great conflict. But he understood the message and had an understanding of the vision. Now I want you to look here at verse 2. In those days, I, Daniel, had been mourning for 3 entire weeks. I did not eat any tasty food, nor did meat or wine enter my mouth, nor did I use any ointment at all until the entire 3 weeks were complete. The problem that Daniel was seeing was that the construction of Jerusalem had begun, but because of the Samaritans, it had been stopped, in essence. The Samaritans wanted to be involved in the rebuilding of the temple. The Jews said, no, we don't want you involved, and there was a difficulty. So this rebuilding had come to a cease, for a better word. Daniel was concerned about that. He was struggling. He didn't understand why. And this is going to encourage him in the knowledge that, yes, it's going to be completed. Yes, things are going to happen. But there's a great but in all of this. In the end, it will be destroyed again. So as we have looked at this, we notice that the 70 weeks prophecy that we talked about back in chapter 9 had 3 intervening times in that vision. The first dealt with the period of time from the decree of Cyrus, which he authorized the rebuilding of the temple in the time when it was to be rebuilt, the streets, the walls, Jerusalem, everything. From the first overthrow of Nebuchadnezzar, now we've seen back in our past lessons that that this decree issued by Cyrus was after that 70 years of them in captivity, but bringing to light a time period, and we talked about those numbers, that it would take to rebuild this and to look forward into what was going to happen with the children of Israel and, in reality, the known world. This period of time was the first interval of the 70 70s or 77s or 70 weeks prophesied as Daniel is recorded. The third interval that we talked about was the 77s or 70 weeks prophesied, including the specific events that would and did take place during these time periods. Both the first and the third 70 weeks prophecy included events that would take place during those periods of time, and not specific to literal time, but to that time of God. When God got ready, he was going to take care of this second thing. Now, the second interval of the 70 weeks, we didn't see that in very much except in passing. But now, he's going to have it explained a little more. So the first interval was for 77s. The second interval was for 62 sevens. The third interval was for 1 7, including or totaling 77s in all. The 62 sevens that we talked a little bit about, didn't get into it a lot, is the period of time between the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the crucifixion of Christ, which would include all the events associated with the coming of a new covenant. Now, there were no details regarding the 62 sevens given except that was necessary to identify its beginning and its end there in Daniel chapter 9. So Daniel's record recorded this vision in his this life of, I can't even see what I'm doing here tonight. Daniel's last recorded vision of his life is a vision of the events that will occur for the most part in the 62 sevens interval. In the 77th prophecy then goes on to the destruction of the temple in AD 70, where the time period for this vision ends. Now, that's important to understand, is we have the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. We have the intral, which is the second, the 62, and then we have the 7 with Christ. At the end of the 7, at the end of all of this, Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. Now think about what Daniel's seeing here. He saw it destroyed with Nebuchadnezzar. It's going to be rebuilt. They have kind of put it on the hold because of the Samaritans. But now we understand it's going to be completed. And from that time until Christ, we're going to have all these things take place. Now, we can't look at each and every one of these, but something I think is important. We find beginning in verse 4 of chapter 10. It says, on the 24th day of the first month, while I was at the bank of the river, great river, that is the Tigris, I lifted my eyes and looked, and behold, there was a certain man dressed in linen, whose waist was girded with a belt of pure gold of Euphra. His body was like beryl, his face had the appearance of lightning, his eyes were like flaming torches, his arms and feet like the gleam of polished bronze, and the sound of his words like the sound of a tumult. Now I, Daniel, alone saw the vision, while the men who were with me did not see the vision. Nevertheless, a great dread fell upon them, and they ran away and to hide themselves. So I was left alone and saw this great vision, yet no strength was left in me, for my natural color turned to a deathly pallor, and I retained no strength. But I heard the sound of his words. As soon as I heard the sound of his words, I fell to a deep sleep on my face, with my face to the ground. Now, this is a little different than what we've seen with Gabriel. Gabriel was an angelic, or is an angelic being. This was a little different. Verse 10. Then behold, a hand touched me and set me trembling on my hands and knees, and said to me, O Daniel, man of high esteem, understand the words that I'm about to tell you, and stand upright, for I have been sent to you. And when he had spoken this word to me, I stood up trembling. And he said to me, do not be afraid, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart on understanding this, and on humbling yourself before God, your words were heard, and I have come in response to your words. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia was withstanding me for 21 days, and behold, Daniel, one of the chief priests, came to help me, so that I had been left there with the kings of Persia. Now, when we go back and we look at all of that illustrativeness in those passages, who does that remind us of? Kind of reminds me of this situation with Saul of Tarsus on the road to Damascus. And we know from the rest of this that Daniel called him Lord. We also know that Daniel fell down to worship this individual and was not told not to. Now, there are some that believe it was just another angel, maybe Gabriel or someone along that line. But as I've read this and I've looked at this, it really sounds a lot like to me about what we see when they talk about the pre-incarnate Christ. So Daniel's not getting this information from some angel, in my mind, but he's getting that from Jesus. Now, verse 14 is important here. This glorious man appeared to Daniel to tell him what will happen. Now, we're back in Daniel's time. Now, Daniel's getting on up there in years, but he's concerned. And in verse 14 of Daniel 10, it says, Now I have come to give you an understanding of what will happen to the people in the latter days, for the vision pertains to the days yet future. Now, latter days. In his grief-stricken state, the halting of the work on the temple, he's talking about latter days. Now remember, we talked about from the starting of the rebuilding of the temple, the end is Jesus, the Messiah, coming, establishing a kingdom. So what would we concur these latter days to engulf this 62 weeks? This is the future from Daniel until Jesus and the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. So when we look at the latter days, so many people in their minds, they're thinking about something in our future. But this was something in Daniel's future. Days, yet future. So what he's going to talk about here are this time period of the 62 sevens. Now, the latter days, Daniel would understand, or should have understood, denotes the ending of the Jewish dispensation, or the fulfillment of the law of Moses. The children of Israel became the children of God for a purpose. And that was to bring forth into the world the Messiah. And when they fulfilled this in God's time, when Jesus came, then all of that was completed. So let's go down to chapter 11 and see what he's talking about here. And I know there's a lot more to this than we can even touch this evening. He begins by talking about the conflict between Persia and Greece, the 4 Persian kings. Now, we've talked a little bit about that in our past other lessons. It says here, verse 1, Daniel 11, "In the first year of Darius the Mede, I arose to be an encouragement and a protector of him. And now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia. When the 4th will gain far more riches than all of them, as soon as he becomes strong with his riches, he will arouse the whole kingdom against the realm of Greece." Now, these 4 kings started with Cyrus. Then we have Cambrius the second. That would be about 530 to 522 BC. We have Darius the Great, 522 to 486 BC, and Xerxes from about 486 until about 465. Now, these are the ones that's going to rise up from Cyrus, these individuals. Now, Xerxes was also called Ahasuerus, and that's kind of an interesting thing because he was the one that rose up. He was the one that became strong and became rich, and when he did this, he decided he wanted to take Greece. Well, there was a problem with that, and there's, like I said, there's so much more here to this. Go back and read all those history books. It's intriguing. In verses 3 through 4, it says, "A mighty Greek king will arise, whose kingdom will break into 4 pieces." Verse 3, Daniel 11. "And a mighty king will arise, and he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases." Who was the great Grecian king that we've talked about? Alexander. Alexander the Great. Look at verse 4. "But as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass, though not on his own descendants, nor according to his authority which he wielded, for his sovereignty will be uprooted and given to others besides them." And we understand that he probably died, Alexander died when he was about 32. He had no born heirs. He and his wife Roxana had an unborn son. She was carrying the child. When he was born, they ended up eliminating him, the child and Roxana. But the thing is that these generals, they took over the kingdom and the rule of the kingdom. So we know what they're talking about here. Continuing on to verse 5, it talks about the conflict between Egypt and Syria. Now, Syria would have been that Babylonian area, nearly all the way, what we know of now as Turkey, and back up in that area, that would be the Assyrians. And it says, "The king of the south will grow strong, along with one of his princes, who will gain ascendancy over him and obtain dominion. His dominion will be a great dominion indeed." Well, the king of the south was Ptolemy the first Soter. Now, Ptolemaic empire in Egypt is interesting because it goes on for a lot of years. And this came from one of these generals with Alexander that come out of Alexander the Great. So here we have this Grecian general that's come in, or these from this Grecian general, and established themselves in Egypt. So they were the ones that was in Egypt, and he even made himself Pharaoh. Remember back, you go back to the pharaohs and all of those. Well, Ptolemy's prince was Seleucus the first Nicanor of Syria, who had left Syria because he was having problems with another one of these generals. So he had come south, but he did gain that dominion. Let's look at verse 6. It says, after some years, they will form an allegiance, and the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to carry out a peaceful arrangement. But she will not retain her position of power, nor will he remain with his power. But she will be given up, those with who brought her in, and the one who sired her as well as he who supported her in those times. Now, the successors of Seleucus and Ptolemy, they were constantly warring over territory. And if you go back and read this history, these folks, if you talk about intrigue, man, that was going on. But the north, the south, they were, these generals, these Grecian generals, they were fighting, constantly coming to war together. But they decided that they would form an allegiance together, and between himself and who was in power in the north was Antiochus II. So he gives Antiochus his daughter Bernice to marry. Now, talking about intrigue, man, we don't want to fight anymore, so here you take my daughter and you marry her, and we'll have a truce. It was a common thing. The problem was that Antiochus II was already married to Laodicea. So, since he was going to marry Beatrice, he got rid of his first wife and sent her somewhere else. Now, that was the struggle. He sent her away. Now, how do you think Laodicea liked that? And she had a son by Antiochus II. Well, she didn't like that too good. So she gets back, gets to Antiochus II, and poisons him, and he dies. Well, who's standing in her way? Bernice and her son. So what does she do with them? She killed them both. Got rid of them. Man, does this sound familiar today? There are places in our world, this same thing's going on. And there are places in our world that there are those who wish they could do it in other places in our world. This same kind of stuff. Man, crazy. So, verse 7. It says, but one of the descendants of her line will arise into his place, and he will come against their army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he will deal with them and display great strength. Also their gods and their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold he will take into captivity to Egypt, and he on his part will refrain from attacking the king of the north for some years. Now, Beatrice was the daughter of Ptolemy II, and Ptolemy II was succeeded by his son, Ptolemy III, the brother of Beatrice. And he was not too happy about the assassination of his sister and his nephew, so he went out to avenge them. Syria and Babylon were plundered, and the territory was gained by Egypt and was held for about 30 years. So think of all this stuff that's going on. People would do anything for power and stay in power. And that's what this whole thing, you go back and you read its history, and that's what it denotes. We want power, and we're going to stay in power. Well, let's look at chapter 11, verse 9. The conflict will accelerate, involving other people, including the Jews. See, the Jews are kind of here in the middle of all this, if you really think about it. Verse 9. Then the latter will enter the realm of the king of the south, but will return to his own land. His sons will mobilize the assembly, a multitude of great forces, and one of them will come on coming and overflow and pass through, and he will wage war up to his very fortress. See there? They're not just going back and forth through the land of Israel. They're overflowing. They're taking everything. Verse 11. The king of the south will be enraged and go forth and fight with the king of the north. Then the latter will raise a great multitude, but that multitude will be given into the hand of the former. Then the multitude is carried away, his heart will be lifted up, and he will cause tens of thousands to fall, yet he will not prevail. For the king of the north will again raise a great multitude, a greater multitude than the former. After an interval of some years, he will press on with a great army and much equipment. Now to those times, many will rise up against the king of the south, and the violent ones among your people will also lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they will fall down. So constant war, back and forth. Well, it continues here in verse 15 and following. The powerful king of the north will rise, then they will fall, and I'm not going to read all of this tonight. But we come down to verse 20. And it says, followed by another who will rule but a short time. Daniel 11:20 says, then in his place one will arise who will send an oppressor through the jewel of his kingdom. Yet within the few days he will be scattered, though not in anger, but in battle. Well, he's talking about Antiochus III and his son Antiochus IV. And he will be a vile man. Daniel chapter 11 and verse 21 says, in his place a despicable person will arise, on whom the honor of kingship has not been conferred, but he will come in a time of tranquility and seize the kingdom by intrigue. Now, this is Antiochus IV. And he was what we might call a rounder. He was a party man. But yet, in his partying, he gained the people, the love of the people. He would give them what they wanted. He would do what they wanted, at least up until the time that he took power. And then his power was not something that was really desirable. He did not have the lineage to be the king, but he did everything that he could with diplomacy, flattery, whatever it took to get in that place. And he did. It says here he used what we see today as campaigning strategies for elected officials to win the approval of enough people to get himself on the throne by hook or crook. Whatever it took. You know, he was the kind of guy, you know, a chicken in every pot and so kind of deal. And then, but when it come down to the nitty gritty, it didn't really pan out too well. I want you to read this at your own. But he shall take the kingdom peaceably, but with intrigue. Verse 22. Daniel chapter 11. The overflowing forces will be flooded away before him and scattered. And so the prince of the covenant, after an allegiance is made with him, he will practice deception, and he will go up and gain power with a small force of people. Everybody else was kind of out. Small force of people took power and control. 24 says, in a time of tranquility, he will enter the richest parts of the realm, and he will accomplish what his father never did, nor his ancestors. He will distribute plunder, booty, and possessions among them, and he will devise his schemes against strongholds, but only for a time. And then we have continued in verses 25 through 28. He provoked the king of the south, the king of Egypt. And as we go through Daniel chapter 11, verses 29 through 32, he blasphemed the king of Israel. So he was standing against Israel. I mean, he was going in, taking these people into his realm, and they were paying him taxes and all of those kind of things again. And as we get down to about verse 32 here, again, those who resisted him valiantly, they turned to ungodliness. He was an ungodly individual. Now, as we get down through this into 36, following all of these, we run into an individual that many of you will probably know the name. The name is Cleopatra. I'm going to tell you, if you go back and read the true history of Cleopatra, Mark Antony, the Ptolemies, all of these, they would do anything to gain power and to keep power. Now, as you go through and you read this, it brings us to that time, that point, the Roman Empire. Of course, with Cleopatra, the Roman Empire is has taken the most of that area. It's under the Roman government. We're talking from England, all over through Europe, probably nearly to India, everything across the North Africa, down to through Egypt to that place just south of Egypt there. I'll think of it after a while. So Rome was in power. And that's what he's talking about here. He's bringing all these, Ethiopia's the one I'm looking at. It's in verse 43. So they've got all this thing under their deal. And it notes that something's going to happen. And that's going to be in verse 12. And that's kind of where I would like to talk next week, is begin there in verse 12. Because verse 12 leads us up to the last of Jerusalem. It leads us up to the destruction in Jerusalem in AD 70. And that's where, sadly, so many people struggle with their understanding of all this, is that Jerusalem was rebuilt, the temple was rebuilt, but it only lasted that time period. What, 70? Or 3.5 years? And we'll talk about that as we go into chapter 21. So we'll look at that next Wednesday evening and kind of get an idea of what Daniel says about it. And if the Lord's willing, we'll continue to talk about that next month. Can you believe this month's nearly gone? We got 2 weeks, or about a week and a half left, 2 weeks left in this month. So we'll talk about that, and you can go back and reread 10 and 11. Please read 12, but 10 and 11. And if you want to go back and do all that historical stuff, it's intriguing to me. Those weren't nice folks. They'd do anything in the world to gain power and to keep power, including murder, immorality. Not everything we see today. It ain't no different. Same old stuff. We'll start there next time.